The 2025 FIDE Grand Swiss has led to a lot of very interesting games as players fight for two spots in the 2026 FIDE Candidates Tournament to decide who will challenge Gukesh for the World Championship match. And yeah, obviously we can't really do justice to all of the really great games in just one video. What I've done is for each round I picked out the game that I felt was especially interesting and instructive, and we're going to go through all 6 of those games I've selected. And along the way you'll see a little bit of what's happening with the tournament as well. But our first game in round 1, really a very nice idea in this game, was between the Azeri GM Aiden Suleimanli against India's Murali Kafikian. With this delayed Alapin move order compared to the immediate c3, it's a line where Black's committed to knight on c6, though it is true a lot of the main lines is do involve knight c6 anyway, but as it happens, yeah, rather than playing the sort of main line of d4 historically and trying to open up the center with something like this, instead Suleimanli plays the move bishop c4 and goes for this more modern approach of just delaying the move of d4 and kind of keeping the options open. Black in turn decides to play the move c4, also trying to take advantage of the delayed move of d4. So bishop c2, d6, of course d5 white would play same thing, en passant, takes, castles. This is all pretty standard theory, in this position. Black does have a quite nice amount of space, but one of white's main ideas in these sorts of positions is also to try to play a move like b3 and just try to get rid of that pawn on c4. Worth noting, by the way, that if black does play a move like knight e5, that we can just take with the rook. As takes, we do have queen e1, so it's not like we're just losing material there, which is why in this position, Karthikeyan played the engine move of castling long. And here's where there's sort of the first choice, where I can try a few different moves, but in the game he played the move of knight to a3, just keeping a little bit of flexibility, and if we can get in b3 and also be threatening to take the pawn, that would be just very, very nice. Obviously, a structure like this one, for example, would just be a dream come true for white, where we can then put our pawn in the center, we can attack their weak open king. So this is clearly what black wants to avoid. And before I do show you this really amazing queen sacrifice that happens a bit after queen f6, do make sure to like the video if you are enjoying it. Also subscribe if you are new to the channel. As you can see here, I'm not just doing 10-minute opening videos, but also a few longer form content every now and then, just to really give you as much value as possible to help you improve your chess and enjoy the process along the way. But yeah, b3 was white's idea. Usually the move bishop e4 is what they played, but then knight e5 and the sort of pin here kind of forced some concessions that are maybe not absolutely ideal from white's point of view. So b3 is a little bit more of a dynamic approach, and in this case, a move that black played I think is quite a natural one. You've already kind of talked about how this exchange of the pawns kind of in white's favor strategically to open up lines and play d4. So black's main attempts here are going to be moves that try to disrupt things in some way, and knight d5 is kind of an example of such a disruptive move, threatening knight c3 to use the pin on the pawn. But the thing is that when your opponent makes a threat, a really good question to ask is whether we can just ignore that threat. And it turns out you actually can. You're not forced to play a passive move like bishop b2 that kind of allows black to show their dynamic potential. But rather you can actually just ignore it with knight takes c4. Black could also play the move knight takes c3 immediately, but kind of go for a similar version of what we'll see in the game. But in the game, black played a little bit differently. For the theoreticians wanting to explore these lines, I'd say the move g5 is going to be kind of the key move, which is, obviously a bit more of a dynamic approach. There's game Theodoro against Duden, where after bishop e3 and b5, black was kind of able to, to sort of get enough counterplay to sort of survive here. But in the game, black played the move of b5 instead, which is a suggestion of the computer, but it turns out that after knight b2, this is kind of Suleimanli's new idea in the game. After take. So you might be wondering what exactly is white's compensation for, for giving up the queen for the two minor pieces in a sense. And it turns out the move b5 is a very weakening move, that just long term the king is just going to be very, very weak, and that's really where a lot of white's compensation comes from. And also, it does take black some time to kind of get the remaining piece into the game, time that white can certainly use to try to open up the lines and have a strong attack on the king. Yeah, in this position, I think e6 is quite natural. Of course, queen c3 is also a rather important question, just grabbing the pawn. But it does mean that white does get some, lead in development, like queen rook e3 and a4 is kind of one approach where you just try to open the queen side and black kind of has to try to keep it closed. But even here, white can still play moves like rook e4 and rook c4 and, kind of eventually arrange the pieces just to have a really strong attack on the king. Also, even bishop e3 is kind of an interesting idea where you sort of sack the knight, but you end up kind of hitting this knight and it makes life kind of difficult. But that's a little bit of a computerish line, I have to admit. Like, you sort of just play really slowly with bishop e2 and just kind of slowly build this attack, which is probably not what most people are thinking when you initially see such a line. Okay, that's getting a little bit into the weeds. Let's see how the game actually played out with e6. And yeah, this was kind of the key moment of the game after g4. Because yeah, bishop g6 is very automatic, but it actually turns out to be a decisive mistake here. And black's best bet actually is probably to play a move like bishop to a3, which obviously, yeah, if you don't have the engine on, it's kind of hard to just go down in material again. But on the other hand, it's also true that white's coordination is now not the best, that, black is threatening to get back some of that material with a move potentially like rook d1 at some point. Also, queen c3 is also on the agenda. So it's kind of a good example, albeit an extreme one, of kind of the Capablanca principle. That, you give back some material against the opponent's gambit, but then you're able to sort of take back the initiative in return. But instead, after bishop g6, yeah, white was really quite ruthless in finishing it off from here. If you want, you can pause here and try to figure out what a continuation is. Not just the first move that Suleimanli played, but kind of the follow-up as well, just to kind of test your skill in taking this dynamic advantage and converting it into a win. Now the move a4 isn't terrible here, but it's going to be a lot more effective to play the move bishop g5. And this really shows the importance of flicking in the seemingly weakening g4, is that, well, black now has to sort of take the poison pawn. We are hitting the knight with the skewer, so it's not like we're just losing a piece here. But in this point, once you kind of see this move of knight e5, it just all comes together, where we're going to bring that bishop to f3 and have this machination of all kinds of monster-discovered attacks with the rook. And even though black has a tempo to do something about it, it just turns out that they can't really do a whole lot. Like if f6 or some other move, we can even just ignore their threat, because our threat of the discovered attack is just way stronger. So black ends up giving back the queen, trying to stabilize, because usually if your opponent, your kind of strong attack, trading the queens is one way to try to neutralize it. But the problem here is that after a very nice move, bishop d8, the king is just getting chased all around, and after a4, you can't even take the pawn because of rook a5 and the crisscross checkmate. So the game ended bishop d3, bishop c6, and eventually, yeah, black just can't really deal with all this. Like after takes, rook c5. Note here that if black does try to flick in the little intermezzo, the move rook c6 does come with a check, and we are able to defend our extra piece on the next move for a winning game. In the game, it was rook g8, and yeah, it was sort of just very nice opening preparation. Like nowadays, people know they're very, very well prepared in the opening, but it's clear that, Kafikian forgot the lines, and white just had this very nice idea that he showed with the queen sack, and yeah, black's not really able to kind of try to get a fortress with, say, the pawn on g6 and king on g7, because the king is just a bit too far away for that to really happen, and yeah, after a few more moves, white's kind of able to sort of pick off this pawn one way or another, and, finally, after a few more moves of rook h4, not falling for the pin, as it were, black just resigned in this position. So a very nice win by Suleimanli. I also think that there's definitely an idea that if you're an e4 player is a nice one to have in your arsenal, because the Alapin does lead to quite direct play, and it is quite natural and easy from white's point of view. And if black is having some problems even in the most critical line that we see here, I think other lines do give white better chance of an opening advantage, generally speaking, then yeah, it sort of speaks well for the overall health of this variation from white's point of view. But in any case, let's move on to the next game, and this one's a bit of a crazy one. you will notice I include quite a few black wins as well, and this one was a game between Haikamata Roshan from Armenia, playing against one of the top players of the world, Arjun Erigaisi. And yeah, he decided to go for King's Indian defense. One thing that's nice about King's Indian is that even though it's a system that if white plays perfectly, they probably get a small edge out of the opening, it is a system where you're always going to get a fighting position. Like, even if the Indian is not a big fan, you always are going to have some chances. Yeah, H3 is a little bit of a different move order compared to E4, but, it doesn't make that big of a difference at the end of the day. After rook E8, E4, ED4, the main alternative is to go for C6 and some approaches like this, but these days modern ninja just think that the C5 gambit is just really, really strong, and that's kind of why the directions shift a little bit towards more of these ED4, and these kind of lines that were played a little bit in the Zurich 1953 candidates tournament. And there are a few choices. You can play A5 if you really want to avoid the move B4. You can also play bishop D7 and kind of provoke B4, saying it's a little bit of a weakening move right at this point. And these lines do have quite a decent reputation from Black's point of view. Bishop D7, you also have ideas of potentially using the rook's pawns to try to create attacking chances. But H6 is a little bit of a trendy variation, where you just kind of going to potentially have some ideas of knight E6 and knight G5. And you're just going to try and show up that H3 pawn can be a little bit of a weakness in some lines. So at this point, White ends up playing the move of knight B3, and to be fair, there are a few different moves that White can play here. For example, you can play a move such as rook B1 and just prepare B4 in that sort of way, to try to avoid some tactical problems. I mean, you may also have the move of just B3, and it's just useful to get the rook off the long diagonal to avoid some tactical problems. That being said, Black does have some ways to get some counterplay, so it's not, just one-way traffic by any means. Also, the knight can sometimes try to come around here as well. But, yeah, basically, it's just a very rich position, and also a move such as King H2, like, if you want to be prophylactic, it's also possible, but it does tend to make moves like H5, H4 a bit better later when the king is on this diagonal. So there it is, these little salties that kind of come into the variation. I mean, I'm not a big expert at this line, so yeah, you'll probably want to do your own research if you're a more advanced player, but yeah, after knight b3, Black realizes that, the exchange of the knights just kind of helps White to just activate the pieces, so he says no thank you. F4 just takes away knight g5, and this next move is a bit of a tricky one, but I am kind of curious to know how you would deal with Black's idea of playing a4 in this position, because it's not as obvious as you might think. Also, by the way, for these polls, you can also put in the comments down below, like, what move you would play in the position. That can help you to, really learn the maximum from these sort of training videos. But yeah, if you do play a move like bishop e3, which I think is a move many people would probably think of, after a4, knight d4, because if you play knight d2, I do think that you can run into some little problems with, like, knight h5 and a3, and you do have to be a little bit careful of this sort of thing. But in the case of knight d4, yeah, Black is able to take, and it looks a bit weird, but again, you can sort of get some counterplay with the move c5, like, just very, very concrete. Obviously, it looks really bad to create this weakness, but the point is that with a5, we're going to kind of create some weaknesses in their camp as well, because if they play b3, we've got this little typical King's Indian trick of knight d4, taking advantage of loose pieces dropping off, and when we're going to either win the exchange or, have the unopposed dark squared bishop, that's going to really be the most important factor in the position here. So that's why the move a4 by Martirosyan is just a very good move. Yeah, you are creating the b4 hole, but the knights are a very long way away from that square. So that weakness is just not that big of a deal, and yeah, probably objectively, knight d7 is probably the best move. Although the engine's idea of kind of taking and going knight c5 is a little bit strange looking, but it sort of turns out that it's harder to actually kind of get at the long diagonal than you might think. And yeah, it's a sort of position where, something like bishop d4 and e5 certainly looks very human, but it's kind of hard to actually follow it up somehow with a really concrete way of actually getting at the king, just because of how locked up the position kind of is at this point. But instead, Erigaisi plays h5, and the idea of h5 is, yeah, just to try to create some weaknesses in the king side. Now, objectively, it's probably not the best move, but it gives him a more dynamic sort of position. And after h4, yeah, the move g4 is certainly quite a natural one. The computer kind of likes flicking in this intermezzo of f5 and only then g4, kind of avoid the idea that sort of comes up in the game. But of course, there's nothing wrong with just keeping the position with g4 either. But here's where Aragaisi shows his idea of g5, which, if you play Knight awful lot, you'll probably know this idea of luring that pawn away from f4 to get the e5 outpost for your knight. Similar kind of concept here, and yeah, objectively it turns out not to be probably that good, but somehow black kind of just makes it work. Like in this position here, for example, moves such as queen c2 might seem a very weird one to just let black kind just take back the pawn and have the outpost. But it sort of turns out that white also gets squares like the f5 square for the knight, which is probably even a better square. And the queen c2 does help defend the pawn. So that's sort of a simple way in which white could have, let's say, kind of kept the control and sort of kept a clear advantage. But in the game, white plays knight d4, which also a seemingly very natural move here. Knight to e5, and very nice move of knight f5, realizing that, yeah, black is threatening to take on c4, but still for the moment the material is equal, and not only that, but black's king is also very, very exposed at this point. Note that, for example, if black were to play a move like knight takes g5 here, well, yeah, black is currently up a pawn, but what's more important is that black's king is just way too exposed. We're going to tee up everything on that long diagonal, and there just isn't realistically going to be a long-term defense for black on these on this color complex. And so in the game, I mean, the computer kind of wants to go bishop c3 and knight g5 to try to avoid that problem, but it is still a position where white's moves are fairly kind of apparent, like rook b1, rook f1, the rook can kind of swing over in a lot of positions, and it's just, very easy for white to kind of build up the attack here. So, Aragaisi's move at c6 does at least kind of keep things messy. I will admit I probably don't have time really to do full justice to this game, because it is a very complex one. But knight g7 was, again, a very good move to kind of weaken the black king, kind of transform the advantage. Black objectively should probably take with the knight in light of white's next move, but in the game, he played king takes, and e5 was just very, very strong. And also the idea of e5 is just basically to clear e4 for the knight and just really get at the black king that way. So a very nice idea. And after d5 trying to cover that, at this point you would probably think that, white is probably just going to win this game because, the material is equal, but black's king is just so weak and so many of the pieces are undeveloped. But it's also a very dynamic position where anything can really happen, and probably the best move here might just be to play a move like queen d2, where you just kind of defend the pawn and kind of ask black what they're going to do about it. Because actually you also have the point of g6 as well, where you kind of sack the pawn, but then the queen kind of gets into h6, and just your piece just flooding the attack from there. So it would have been a really nice idea that in the game king h1 kind of was a little bit slow. But to be fair, white is still much better anyway, but yeah, somewhere in the chaos and time trouble is also a bit of a factor. Queen f3 is maybe just a little bit of a step in the wrong direction, where again I think white had to just try to be a lot more dynamic, like either going for g6 or just trying to get the attack happening more quickly. It wasn't really a position where you can just quietly build up in a certain sense. Black plays knight dc5, probably b6, and this might be a bit more precise to kind of deal with the pressure against the f7 pawn that might arise, but knight dc5 was played, trying to attack the pawn. It does make some sense. And it turns out probably white should play a move like rook f1 and just kind of ignore the attack and just play for mate. And that would have probably been, the way for white to really keep a very big advantage. But once he plays a sort of passive move, just kind of losing the overall, I guess, momentum, then the trend of the game does start to shift more towards black's point of view, and now we kind of see the difference, and now we even have an improved version of the b6 line, because we kind of made them play this passive move along the way. Just bear with me, there we go. And white, you sort of realize, okay, I need to do something because the trend of game is kind of going against me. But the problem with b4 is you are kind of weakening some things on the queen side as well. Like even here, the rook can't really swing over to the king side, which kind of proves surprisingly stable. After queen f6, it is a little bit surprising to me that Aragaisi didn't just take on queen f6. Like, just on the practical level, it just seems a lot more healthy, where your king is not really in any danger of getting mated with the queens off the board. And if white goes rook b6, you do have knight d3, where you are going to have this fork. Of course, if the rook moves along the e-file, the bishop will hang. And here, yeah, you're just able to kind of stabilize. Like, worst case, you can even often put the knight on g6 and just protect the king that way. And you have this very strong center, which makes white's pieces very, very passive. And so this position would just be, I think, much better for black if we take stock from here. Like, the bishops just aren't really making their presence so felt, let's say. But in the game, we had king g8. White was playing queen h6, and it looks like maybe white can try to escape here. When I was watching this game live, I thought that bishop d3 and just trying to stop this might be the most natural. Computer says you can still sack the pawn anyway, and it's still going to be okay for white. But of course, it's just, yeah, very, very chaotic position where, like, all three results are going to be possible. Though I do think it is probably a lot easier to play black, because somehow white's king and queen are a little bit stuck, and somehow black has a bit more energy to the position, let's say. The black goes knight to d3 instead, forking the rooks, and here is where white kind of makes just sort of a couple of big mistakes. I mean, it's a very back and forth game, of course, but it turns out what white had to find was this move of rook to d4, which looks crazy, like you're putting both rooks on pre, but kind of the point is that if knight d4, you can then go g6, and somehow the attack is just really, really strong with the queen and the bishop coming in. And if you take the other rook, then there's this knight e4 move, where you can't really allow knight f6, but then if you take, you kind of have this similar problem that once you get in g6 and once the bishop comes in the attack, it's just going to be completely crushing. So, yeah, very computerish, very hard to find out time on the clock in the game. The move g6 was played, which is, to be fair, is not such a bad move either, in fact. But after takes, I think really had to sort of take on g6 and, yeah, probably play it this way in order to try and bring the pieces in the attack. Because rook f1 does give black a little bit of an opportunity, and again, this is like very, very hard. Like, we're sort of really relying on the computer analysis to know what's going on. But it turns out that you do have this really amazing rook a7 move where you're sort of able to meet queen g6 with rook g7 and kind of use that to sort of fend off the attack. In the game, black plays the move knight e5. Like I said, both sides are in very extreme time trouble. And the move rook d1, I think his idea was he wanted to sack on d5 and try to get the piece in the attack. But it's just a little bit too slow. You kind of have to, again, to find a solution, right, you have to almost be a computer. But basically, the idea of rook e1, it looks completely counterintuitive to allow knight d3, but you sort of have this really amazing idea of knight takes d5, where they can't even really sort of take anything, because if they take here, they kind of go takes, and you sort of have just this crushing attack with bishop d5 now, which is sort of the point of knight d5 before. Or if you play knight e1, yeah, white's again sort of able to just flood the piece in the attack, and the threats just end up being a bit too much for black to deal with at this point. But yeah, this is just like very, very computerish territory, of course, to see all of this. In the game, white goes rook d1, and unfortunately for him, the one flaw of his plan is that black does have this move of rook to a7, kind of allowing to sort of defend with the rook compared to a lot of the lines that we saw earlier, kind of seeing white's attack in action. And yeah, basically the way the game ended was knight d5, take. Probably f6 is just a safer square for the queen, just to guard the king, but in the game queen b8 was played. Bishop b2, and actually here white can kind of escape a little bit with the move bishop e5, and it turns out even though that white is down a piece here, the fact that this rook is so offside, it actually kind of gives white the sort of some chance to potentially save the game here. But after knight c5, at this point white probably just has to take the pawn on b6, and white actually has decent chance of a draw just because of how strong this pass a pawn is. Like, we'll kick the knight away, and then the pawn will kind of be free to advance. So say rook h7, rook c6, kind of an example of that at play. Because if you play like knight e4, which is the move you want to, well, then you'll have one pawn left on the board, and that might not be enough to win the game. But in the game, white played the move of g5 instead. This was move 40, by the way, so clearly the time pressure was a factor. And I think white was just thinking that, okay, in principle, if I can, eliminate, trade off the pawns, it will bring me closer to a draw. Unfortunately, it just falls a little bit flat here, because if you take on b6, it's just going to be kind of a worse version, where the black rook is a lot more active, and so it's going to be one where maybe white can still draw with perfect play, Like say if you go rook b4 and kind of keep black passive, maybe you can still hold it, but it's obviously going to be a lot tougher compared to the previous variation we saw. In the game, White's attempt to complicate just didn't really work here. Like White probably has to flick in a5 before taking on h4 if they really want to kind of any chance to survive. Because in the game after rook h4, king g8, it was just kind of too much for White to deal with when Black played this very nice move. And this one also makes a good puzzle if you do want to think about it a little bit. But here the key is to find this knight a4 trick. They can't take the rook because of the bishop b5 fork, and the arising position with the extra exchange is going to be winning when their king is not really able to deal with the pawn, let's say, as our rook has cut it off, and we will be able to get in this way, for example. But in the game, rook d6, black is just basically a piece up here, and the rest was kind of a matter of technique. Note, by the way, bishop d5 is not going to work here to get the piece back, as we do have the move rook d5 and bishop c6 to hit and win like so. So the game goes rook g4, and I know we spent a bit more time on this one than some other games that we'll see, but it was, a very complicated game, and in the end, Black just showed a good technique to finish off the win, with White resigning here. So this is a very nice example, like very messy, very sharp game, and I think we can really use this as a model for how to play well in complicated positions that, okay, even the best players in the world are not going to play perfectly by any means these chaotic positions, but at least it kind of shows how you can sort of put pressure and kind of provoke mistakes from the opponent. With that being said, I do want to also touch on the round 3 game between Firouzja against Maghsoodlu, our 2 Persian players, and basically it was just like very theoretical to start with, in knight off. But instead of going for the main line of the English attack, with these positions already being a little bit kind of worked out in a sense, with h5 or, the old main line of this stuff, instead of all this, White goes h3, it's sort of still preparing g4, but with a little bit less fury attached. After bishop e6, if you play a move like g4, Black can kind of go d5 and hit back in the center. So that's kind of the reason why usually as White you're going to see a little bit of a different approach. I have a queen f3 and long castles. About a decade ago I did write a yearbook survey on f4, but those lines have kind of been worked out to equality as well if Black knows their theory. But queen d2 is sort of a fresh approach by Firouzja, saying, okay, I'm just going to play something a bit less theoretical, like, maybe in theory the pawn is not as good on h3 as f3, but at least we're going to play a game of chess and we can try to outplay the opponent. b5 and knight d7 obviously would still be, perfectly fine for Black as such, kind of saying that g5, b4 is kind of better than usual when, when the e4 pawn is undefended. But in the game, Black goes a5, Maghsoodlu maybe wanting to avoid the bulk of Firouzja's preparation and just try to get a game of chess. So f4, rook c8. There are different moves both sides can play, but all of this I think is pretty standard. And White's idea, is to kind of actually swap off into an endgame. Now, it's possible that Maghsoodlu might have mixed up his preparation a little in this case, just because the move of bishop d8 is probably the more reliable move if we if we talk about the engine analysis. I mean, it's also possible maybe he just didn't like the position after takes and just felt that White would just have really good compensation with the bishop pair and Black's pawns being a bit weak. There's only some fun lines like takes where you can really go into the weeds with the computer with the different ideas. But okay, let's see how the game played with rook fd8. I'll probably spend a little bit less time on this game in general, just really mentioning the really critical moments. So at this point, Black's structure is certainly not the best at this moment, but it's still certainly quite playable. And at this point, it's one of these cases where if you're watching this game live like me, like with the weak Stockfish engine, it'll say that, if White plays like a tricky move like bishop c5 here to, use the weak back rank and sort of try to trade the bishops in, sort of in this way, or to move like knight c5, this would be a bit better for White. The reality, though, is that it is still going to be fine for Black. Though it is true that this is not such a bad try, that even though initially it just looks like a blunder to give up the 2 bishops or rook, you do have some dynamic sort of aspects to it that do somewhat justify the play. Like you are probably going to be able to, pick off the pawns on the queen side to kind of make it worth your while. But okay, very complex position, of course. And in the game, White goes knight d5 immediately, to which a move of bishop b4 is a really good reply, realizing that the exchange of knights is actually quite good for Black, as the bishop pair is kind of more important than the double pawns in a sense. So Firouzja plays the move of bishop to b6 in order to go after the pawn on a5. Still, the position, of course, is very, very dynamic. I think that even though it's probably close to equal from a computer point of view, I think it's a lot easier to play black because you've got the bishop pair. It's kind of hard to move these pawns when they're right in front of the king, so I think it's just going to be a lot easier to handle black's position in general. Also, to move h5 would be a very interesting idea here, actually, just to not let white move the pawns and kind of fix the minority in place in a sense. But black plays g6, which is certainly an understandable enough move from a human point of view to make that heir for the king, maybe clear the way for the bishop. But white plays c3. I'm going to fast forward a little bit here, even though the game is like very, very interesting, because it is true that there are, other games to get to as well. And really where it starts to get more critical is some moves later. At this point, black is certainly doing quite well. Although I think if white goes king c1, it's still probably not that bad for white at this point. Like after bishop h6, you have these moves like b4, where like even though you're giving up a pawn, you kind of have enough sort of counterplay with the pass a pawn later that you can kind of make it work anyway. Of course, position's still like very, very unclear, but king b3 maybe a little bit of a step in the wrong direction here. After rook b8, we kind of see some problems with the pin potentially. Knight d8, knight c5. Like even looking at the knights, we kind of feel a little bit white's lack of coordination. King a2, bishop c2. Max Zuli has been playing this tournament at 2900 plus performance level, according to the engine analysis. And, well, considering he's leading with 5 out of 6, it's perhaps not the biggest surprise. e4, knight d5, and yeah, at this point it was one where maybe this is the first moment where black was not playing like a perfect game of chess. Because I think if black plays the move of rook c8, kind of with the idea of just sort of steadily improving the position, kind of waiting for the right moment to kind of go f5 or knight d3, I think that would probably just be winning for black, because white just can't really move their majority, and that's really what it comes down to. In these situations is basically a pawn race. The difference with f5, I don't want to call f5 an outright mistake, because it's a very natural move, but the difference is that it does give white this chance to play the move of g4, and kind of split up the black structure a little bit. Now, if you're a computer, you'll still play like e3, and still say that this position is much better for black anyway, but that's again very computerish kind of idea to just seemingly give up a pawn for nothing. But black goes hg4 instead, and okay, after f4, white does manage to at least trade off some pieces and trade off that pawn on e4, such that black is obviously still better, but now white might be able to survive if they play it correctly. But the onus is still on white. With rook h8, the threat of mate is obviously a thing. White covers it with knight f2, the only move here. Black plays bishop c5, and you can sort of feel how the bishops are kind of raking the board here in such a position, especially compared to the knights are a little bit discombobulated. Red rook d7, king g6, and to Firouzja's credit, he does find some good defensive moves like rook b7 here to sort of try and trade off the bishop pair. Because if you try to keep the bishop pair, you can run into some annoying moves like knight e5, and you can't go king f6 because of knight d7. So, yeah, there's tricks like that you've got to be a bit careful of. But in the game, black goes bishop f2, take, and this was kind of really the critical position of the game in a certain sense. Because if white plays the right move here, they can hold. If you want to try and solve it in your own time here, like to pause video and think about it, it's a tough one because Firouzja got it wrong. So if you get it right, you've played it better than you're one of the youngest player ever to break 2800 FIDE. But what white had to do is I had to play the move rook b8 in this position. And it's not just as simple as just rooks behind passed pawns, but there is also the idea that it's kind of hard for black to find a great square for the king somehow. Because if king g7, we have this little bit of a knight e5 intermezzo, where like normally the position when you have like the competing majorities, the bishop is just going to win over the knight. But here white's kind of got this blockade where you can sort of blockade these pawns and still push your own pawns, meaning that actually white's not in any sort of danger here. And if black plays king e6 instead, it kind of turns out that again it's going to be a similar idea. They're just kind of hard to really get out of the checks. If king d6 maybe is the best try to try at least keep the rooks on the board, because normally you want to have rook and bishop. It's going to be stronger than the rook and knight. But again, white can kind of just be annoying. Like in the worst case, I might be able to sacrifice the knight for the pawns. still have their own kind of passer running, and that'll probably give white enough counterplay to draw at the end of the many complications from here. But instead white goes rook b6. And it's a little bit of a bluff in some ways, because it turns out you can actually just take it with bishop b6. And I think what Firouzja kind of missed, even though he had made the time control well and truly by this point, I think he just missed it. You could play rook h7 and then cut off the king with rook to d7, which means that black's pawn is actually going to be faster than white's pawns, even though white's passed pawn is a bit more advanced, and even though he has connected passed pawns, well, black is just faster. And once you have to then stop your knight helping the pawn, and you have to use your knight then to stop their passed pawn, and the knight's just generally not that great at stopping passed pawns, generally speaking, well, it buys black the time he needs just to cover those pawns with his king, so c5. You could play king d8 as well. It kind of has a similar idea of blocking the pawns, but rook d8 also gets the job done here. c6, king d6, and at this point, the pawn's just dropping off like flies, so Firouzja just resigned here. And yeah, also note by the way, if white does try something like knight to e5, trying to be tricky, that you can even just play king b7, because takes rook e3 does win the knight in the game. So, very nice game by Magsudlu, just really showing like why people love to play the knight off, just kind of get this complex position. It's just, yeah, very, very pleasant to play in that sense. And yeah, where you also can fight for the win with the black pieces. The next game I want to share, this is a really beautiful game actually. It actually features two junior players, namely Aditya Mittal, who I think recently won some open tournament just before this, against Yagis Dogmas, not just the highest rated ever player like for his age at 14 years of age, but actually the youngest, strongest player on the live ratings, like even below the age of 19, which is pretty amazing. Now this DC4 is actually kind of a bit of an interesting version of the Queen's Gambit declined. Basically, kind of the idea is that in some positions, if they play like e3, for example, you're just going to kind of have an improved version of a Queen's Gambit accepted. I might say Queen's Gambit, I might say Queen's Gambit accepted, of course. But like having the knight on c3 sort of reduces some of white's better options for white that might involve, say, going into an ending or having the open diagonal for the bishop as such. Obviously, with knight on c3, this doesn't really make sense anymore for white, let's say. So therefore, the more critical approach is to play a move like e4 and try to do something in the center as Mittal does in the game. And after takes, yeah, here white has a little bit of a choice. Like I was actually looking at this position recently, trying to sort of figure out what to recommend for a student as such. In the game, white plays ed5, but knight d5 is also a move, of course. Though I do think that this sort of simplified position is one that, yeah, it's not really that much for white. Like white probably has a very small edge with knight e2, but it's nothing too, nothing too drastic. Let's say black is still solid with no weaknesses after some quite normal moves, as it were. Queen d5 might be a better try. This is sort of the suggestion of Leighton in his notes, saying that this sort of endgame with ed5 is going to be that bit better for white. I mean, yeah, it's probably true that white does have a little bit of an edge. Perhaps just a move like bishop f5 is kind of an interesting one to explore, but it is true that white should probably be somewhat better in this case as well. Anyway, that's a bit of a digression more for the theoreticians, but the actual game saw ed5, and here you actually want to play the move of knight e7, not knight f6, because if knight f6, the queen e2 check just ends up being really, really annoying. Like queen e7, knight b5 is a little bit of a trick you have to watch out for. But obviously when the knight's on e7, you're not worried about this, because it doesn't come with check anymore. Yeah, white can sort of choose whether to play knight f3, whether to play knight e2. I think that, yeah, h3 feels a little bit weird compared to the immediate knight f3. Like maybe it was just a move played to try and get black out of his preparation or something. But yeah, and it's something you'll kind of notice with a lot of these games is that nowadays, like, the main lines have sort of been worked out to death by the engine, so strong GMs do often like to look for a way to just sort of, like, get a game and avoid, like, the massive fury, and maybe try to surprise the opponent as well. So black goes knight b6, and b3 is also a good move by white, so that, as the game kind of showed as well, like, once the bishop is exchanged, it kind of gives white a protected pass pawn. That being said, the pawn is blockaded, and black does have the bishop pair. So, it's a position where both sides definitely have their chances. You could play rook e8, you could play bishop f5. Like, there's a lot of reasonable developments for black, but in the game, black goes for knight g6, which is also fine. The knight can either try to trade on e5, Or maybe later on we leverage their move h3 to use f4 as a bit of a semi-outpost for the knight. Obviously, it depends on what white does as well. There's again a lot of options like queen d3, bishop g5, rook e1. Like all these moves are, I think, fairly natural. In the game, white goes knight e4, just trying to simplify. But I think that even though you're trading off the bishop pair, I do think that on a general sort of level that white's bishop might look like it's quite nice, but we can sort of blunt it with f6 in the worst case. And meanwhile, these pawns are kind of fixed on light squares, so the position objectively is equal, but I do think white has to be a little bit careful sometimes of, the light squares being a bit weak here. And here black has a little bit of a choice, where I think on Dogmas' move of a5, it reminds me a lot of like the Spassky-Fischer game in the Hubner Nimzo, where Fischer went for a similar idea. Not sure it's necessarily the most precise, because I'm not sure if the move a5 is even something to be that afraid of. But one positive of playing the move of a5 is that you kind of keep the game going. You don't let white just simplify everything and maybe make an easy draw. You're here to have to actually make some, find some good plans. I kind of like rook a2 potentially as a way to try to attack the pawn, but the game saw rook to e1 instead, going for this fight for the file. Bishop e3. Yeah, I mean, all these moves are pretty natural by both sides, like rook a2, bishop e4, just trying to create a little bit of tension. Of course, you could also play like knight f4, like there's, again, a lot of fine moves for black. But it's around this point that the game really starts to get very, very interesting, in my opinion. Because here, white probably has to just swallow his pride a little bit and play the move of bishop to d2. Accepting it, okay, in a position like this, it's probably just going to end up being, just about equal, and, probably it would be a draw if both sides play it somewhat decently. Though, of course, with the balance, you never know, but as it happens, yeah, the game saw knight d2 instead, and I mean, maybe black just assumed that with some threats like, say, bishop c5 and this sort of thing that, the black kind of has to retreat the bishop in a sense. But that actually is not the case. And the move knight h4 is just a really strong move, just threatening this pawn, clearing the way also for queen g6, which is actually what happened in the game after bishop c5 and now queen g6. Bishop c5 is probably not the best move here, but you can sort of understand white wanting to be consistent with his idea. But yeah, queen g6, threatening the checkmate. White's only real move here is to play g3. And again, this is a position where, yeah, if you find this move as black, I think it's kind of impressive, but what would be your continuation as black from here? So maybe you've put it in the comments below, like this is for the Mittal against the Dogmas game, in case you're wondering. But yeah, in this position, there's actually kind of two solutions. I'll say that bc5 isn't really one of them, because after the exchanges, like even though the white king is a little bit exposed, you can sort of maintain the balance as white because of your really strong pass d pawn. And it's also a little bit hard to kind of really get the rook in the attack because, we're kind of controlling the b file and we can sort of, bring it over to the e file if needed. Say if they go queen h4 or something. But yeah, here you can either play the move bishop f5, which is going to kind of transpose into the game, or the way that Odogmas played it was the move bishop to g2, discovering this attack here. And obviously, you can't just take, because if you take, you just get mated with rook h1. So white plays bishop e7, trying to cut it off. Bishop h3, and we kind of have this funny double pin where they can't take on the knight either way, as it turns out. White goes king h2 here. Yeah, I mean, in this position, king h2 is probably a fine move, to be fair. And position here starts to just get, like, very crazy, where at this moment, black's best option actually is a little difficult, but it's probably best to actually play bishop to d7. At first, it might look like you're just giving away the knight, but actually, the point is that you have this little trick of rook e7, and then after takes and queen d6. The reason we need to move the bishop away first, well, there are kind of a few reasons, but one is that after they play queen g3, it really helps that our bishop is safe in this position. And with white's king being exposed and white having a litany of weaknesses, I do think black is quite comfortably better in a position like this. Instead, black goes knight g2, which, I mean, I get the temptation, you want to attack their rook and keep the momentum going. But white's reply of rook e5 and sort of avoiding the whole queen h5 is just very strong. And yeah, like Mittal just plays it very, very well with this, like queen takes b6. using the pin again to stop black's ideas. And the position is kind of, yeah, in a sort of weird sort of balance according to the engine. But from a human point of view, yeah, it's just a very unclear position. But I do think that knight f4 is a good practical try-burr dogmas, because white's best move, I think, is not so obvious here. Like, black is defending the queen and is threatening to take. Obviously, you can't take the knight because of mate. So, white has to, yeah, figure out what to do. And this is also a good puzzle for more advanced players to try to improve your defending skills, but it turns out the move that was playing a rook e4 is actually a rather big mistake, in fact, and that the only move to hold is actually the move of rook to e3. And the difference is that basically with the rook on e3 instead of e4, it means that when bishop f5 comes, you're not hitting that rook there. So it means that white will be able to kind of survive. Like, it ends up basically coming to a perpetual check one way or the other. Obviously, you don't want to run into rook e1, bishop h3, but after the king moves, yeah, it just ends up being a draw by perpetual. That would be maybe like the correct result of the game if white had found rook to e3. But he played rook e4 instead, and as you probably have surmised, yeah, the move of queen h5 is going to be the key here. That they can't take the knight with the pawn as we already discussed. And in the case of rook f4, which was white's idea, the problem is that now we cut off the rook h4 defense. And after king to g1, rook e7, well, this is pretty close to a mate threat, let's say. White goes rook a1, but we see now that it's just very hard for white to really cover this square in a good way. If you play rook b1, queen b1 to try to cover it, even just a move like rook e2 is just going to make it very hard for white to defend the king. You can really feel the energy of black's pieces here. So white tries rook f1, trying to cover it. And actually, it's not such a bad move, like saying, okay, I'm going to do a prophylaxis against rook e1. Now, it turns out that actually probably rook e1 should have been played anyway, just because it turns out that the threats of, like, bishop h3 is just a little bit too much for white to deal with somehow. But instead, black goes bishop to h3 first, which also looks quite strong on the surface, but actually it does give white a little bit of an intermezzo where if they had found this rather difficult move of rook h4 and especially difficult to follow up of seeing this queen b1 and kind of defending yourself tactically with the bishop being a bit overloaded. Yeah, if you see that, then it's actually kind of white who's doing quite well, but okay, the players, of course, are quite low on time at this point, and the move of d6, as natural as it's trying to create counterplay, now the idea doesn't work quite as well as before, so white goes rook h4, and again, like, the move for white, like, it's not very human, like, the move that white should probably play here to maintain the balance is sort of to sacrifice the exchange, but in return for sacking the exchange, you kind of defend your king, where you sort of stop the rook e1 mate ideas, and you do have these connected pass pawns that are actually pretty dangerous to deal with, so the line goes a bit deeper, but it basically ends up just coming to ultimately this sort of equal position where, you know, white is currently a pawn up, but their rook is kind of passive and the king is a bit more exposed. So, you know, black probably is going to end up, you know, either just getting a perpetual check or, you know, trading off these pawns to, you know, for it to end up being a draw. Instead, white goes queen b5, and there's a really beautiful sequence that comes at the end here. You know, if white plays queen b8, they can probably still hold, but they do have to find this really amazing move here. And I mean, we kind of said it already as a puzzle in a similar situation to kind of know the idea. But I mean, this one, yeah, like any serious chess coach obviously going to have in their files. And queen b1 is that key move where we defend against this, but we also can meet rook d2 with rook h3 because of the pin. And that kind of allows white, yeah, to basically save the game. Obviously not the easiest thing to see in time pressure, but after d7 instead, which, you know, might also appear like it is saving white's bacon because of the, you know, the queen and, you know, being up material here. Well, the problem here, and actually this is probably the best position to set as a puzzle, actually, to see if you find it. I know I've set a lot of puzzles for this, so it does mean that, you know, the video will be a bit longer, but it is important to me that, yeah, this is, like, also a really high quality training for you, like, just because it's free doesn't mean I think we should compromise on the quality by any means. But yeah, what do you think is the solution for black? And, you know, don't just guess it, but like, try to figure out the solution all the way at the end. You know, that will really do wonders for your calculation. Yeah, well, it'll be fun to see who got it right in the comments below. But the answer here is that, and I really love this move. It turns out, while rook d8 is actually also technically winning, the winning move that, like, just wins on the spot is actually queen takes f2. And the point of queen f2 is that well, we kind of end up sort of getting a smothered mate in on the king. Like, all the moves kind of forced, so even though it's a 6-move checkmate, it shouldn't be that hard to calculate if you've, like, practiced your puzzles. So king g4, f5, and yeah, we get this checkmate with, white having two queens in the final position, which is kind of crazy. But yeah, I mean, this is all combination, like, even, like, 100 years from now, we're still going to be talking about, like, the Dogmas's amazing queen sack, the way we talk about games like, Carlson Ernst and Tal Botvinnik, Botvinnik Capablanca, and so on and so forth. But anyway, moving on to, and of course, Rubinstein's Immortal, among others. But okay, moving on to the next game I have here. This one was between Bluebaum against Pragnananda, and it's sort of a game that I think a lot of people might miss it because it wasn't did maybe not seem the most exciting initially. But I just thought the way Bluebaum played was very impressive because, I mean, before this game I was honestly thinking that Prague was probably going to break 2,800 FIDE very quickly, and Bluebaum plays this amazing game against him. Also, note by the way, like from the opening point of view, you could probably argue that against this kangaroo system with Bishop b4, and then a move like Bishop d2 or Knight d2 might potentially give White better chances for the advantage. I guess if Knight d2, maybe they can play c5, and that might not be so bad for Black, to be fair. But after Knight c3, yeah, in this position, like Black's best option probably is just to play Knight f6 and transpose back to the Nimso. You could also play b6 and transpose the English defense. Like, there are obviously a lot of different things that one can try here, like c5 and so forth. But yeah, bishop c3, yeah, just strikes me maybe not so precise. He's trying a little bit too hard to unbalance the position, and e4 kind of is a nice little trick as well to really take advantage of that. We go queen g4, and we can kind of have this pressure. Also, for the theoreticians, I'll point out that g4 is actually a very interesting gambit as well that the engine also rather likes. We're kind of saying that if Black takes the pawn, that you just kind of get a little bit too strong of an initiative because your attack on the king side's a little bit too fast for Black to deal with. But yeah, in the game, it turned out that Black's actually not doing too badly out of the opening. But he also, you get this kind of fighting position where White has the bishop pair and a little bit extra space. I guess you could also go queen h4 if you want to, but the game saw queen c2. But yeah, it's a position where Black's structure is certainly a little bit better, but where, White has got this bit of extra space, got the bishop pair to kind of make up for it. So White ends up playing bishop e3. I mean, it's obviously a healthy enough move. I'd probably argue that maybe the bishop is a little bit more active on a square like f4 instead. Maybe with setup like this kind of in mind, for instance. But yeah, it's true that it's not the most critical position, perhaps. After castles, knight d2. I think objectively Black's probably doing okay here, but I was just quite impressed with the way in which Bluebaum kind of outplayed his very strong opponent from here. Now, after king h8, this one doesn't really make a perfect puzzle because there's kind of a lot of moves that White could play, like bishop d3 is sort of an example of the Shanklin principle, where sort of trying to provoke the move of e4, saying that, you shut out their bishop and it's kind of worth the loss of 2 tempi to do that, because the position's a bit more strategic to begin with. I'm not sure if I entirely agree with that assessment, but sort of knowing the idea is quite interesting. Like, to me, I think a move like bishop g5 is a bit more human, where you can still try to play bishop d3, or shut out their bishop with f3, but where, you're not running into that, loss of the tempi that we saw in the other line. But Bluebaum came up with this move of bishop to d1, and I think that it's actually a very good practical move, even though the engine doesn't love it, because you have ideas where you're kind of opening up for the bishop to come around this way. Your rook has now also got one less piece in the way opposite the queen. You're kind of clearing the way to go f3 to kill their bishop or f4 to open. So it's a move that really gives you a lot of flexibility, and I think that makes it a quite tricky move for Black to deal with. Maybe queen f7 might have been a way to try to avoid it, but it ends up being a little bit similar, I guess, to how the game played out, because after f4, Black ends up playing queen f7 anyway, and still the position I think is probably about balanced, so let's see how it played out. Rook f1, rook e7. Gonna fast forward a little bit past here unless there's some move that really jumps out at me. It's sort of a point that, on the one hand, the trade of the rooks is probably good for the site that has the bishop pair, that as more pieces get traded, the more the bishop pair becomes a factor. But also the pawn weaknesses can also become more of a factor as pieces are traded, so it's a little bit of a conflict of principles here, perhaps. I mean, for around this point, there's a lot of good moves that both sides can play, as you might expect. it's not the most, say, critical kind of position. The move of d5 here might be a little bit strange though from White's point of view. I think that creating this backward pawn is a little bit of a concession, even if there's no immediate refutation. I think a move like c5 and just trying to open things up for the bishops probably makes more sense. I mean, I don't think that a position like this is just an automatic draw. There is some clear imbalance to be had, and I think it can only be a good thing to kind of exchange off our double pawns, let's say. But the game saw d5, and from this point it does feel like black is kind of the one pressing from here. But yeah, after this, I mean, maybe knight e5. I don't know if this is a little bit rushed, maybe. Perhaps black would have had slightly more chances if just like go queen c2 and just try to sort of create some little tricks. It might be a little bit more practically unpleasant for white, but after bishop e5, yeah, white's sort of able to trade off a knight where, yeah, you give up the bishop pair on the one hand, but on the other hand, you also kind of messed up their structure, and it just makes things a lot more balanced. And I mean, normally speaking, I think, yeah, from this position, it probably should end in a draw most of the time. B5 being actually a very important move here to, facilitate those kind of equalizing exchanges. And blue in turn also plays a very good reply of c5, temporarily sacrificing a pawn, but at least not allowing the structure to get too damaged, as we are, after all, getting the pawn back. Yeah, I mean, in this position, there's a lot of reasonable moves. I mean, it's clear that Prague just kind of blundered on the move after this one, because if he had kind of realized the problem his original idea, maybe he plays some move like knight f4 or knight e3. I mean, pretty much any move is kind of going to be okay for black, because here you're going to have knight c3 to kind of keep your pawn protected and to maintain the balance that way. But in the game, black played bishop b7, which is sort of the first small step in the wrong direction. Though, to be fair, even here, if you play knight f4, you're probably still okay, just kind of trading off the pawns. And yeah, it turns out the a-pawn's probably not as strong as it looks, so you can still kind of hold here, even, with the passer for white, because you can sort of get at their pawns as well, potentially. But black plays a move c6 instead, maybe thinking that he was simply trapping the knight. And, okay, technically knight is trapped for the moment, but what black had missed, and this one also makes a good puzzle if you do want to pause here. But what Prague had missed is that the move of bishop e4 is just insanely strong here. Because if you play knight e7, the problem is there's just knight b5, and you win this very important pawn. If black doesn't take, knight d6 is crushing, but if you do take, this is not really a great way to stop the passed pawns in a sense. So black goes knight c3, but kind of here the damage is already done. White is up a pawn here. If black does play a move like knight b1 trying to get it back, the problem is that you can even just play like knight a7, c6, and, well, in order to stop the pawn queening, the knight has to come back, but then white is just a very clean pawn ahead. He's just going to bring the king in, kind of use the fox and the chicken coop, so even if black does somehow manage to take this pawn c6, we're just going to take the kingside pawns and win the endgame from there. But in the game after king f7, yeah, it was also winning for white here. Raining quite loudly outside. It's been a big storm, so I'm kind of glad I have the noise suppression on. But anyway, white sort of goes for a very similar plan actually to what I just mentioned, just kind of using that c6 pawn to kind of lure the king and the knight away, so that eventually white's just going to be able to decisively penetrate with the king on the king side. So, yeah, we play a few moves. Note, by the way, white's not ready to play h5 just yet, because there is a move knight f6 that would save the day for black. So white goes around the other way with king f3 first, realizing if they go knight f6, for example, you can kind of, bring the knight around this way to, kind of get in on this side of the board. Obviously, knight g8 is just going to be a bit too slow at the end of the day. But after king b3, yeah, white goes knight e3, and it kind of goes to the same idea I just mentioned, knight g4, knight g8, and yeah, at this point, kind of a very cool little trick here, which it's probably not necessary. A normal move like knight e3 should still win, of course, but king e6 is a very cool way to finish the game. And after the knight sack and king f7, black just resigned here, because what happens is after knight h6, take and h5, white's just going to use the pawn to basically win the black knight. And, if you count the race, it's very clear that, the king is just way faster than black's is by comparison. So, yeah, white just ends up just winning the pawn, knight winning the pawn and winning the game in a very simple fashion. So, very nice game there by Bluebaum, and that leaves us with one more game to have a little bit of a look at. I originally planned for this recap to be 1 hour, and this last game's actually pretty short, so we are going to get pretty close to it. Like, one of the surprise packets of this tournament has been Simon Gumelas from Poland, 2590 FIDE GM. Actually, he recently did like a really nice analysis in the modern chess contest on like against the London Jabava London. I rather enjoyed like his approach to analyzing the variations for black. So clearly a player who knows his theory, and Nihal decides, okay, playing against a player 100 points lower rated, that going into some of the main lines like a6 or knight c6, it might be something the opponent would be just very, very well prepared in. And so he plays this little shortcut of cd4, saying, okay, I'm just going to play just a standard IQP position, one where it's just about really understanding what's going on, and sort of try to outplay on technique. Now, knight c6 would actually transpose kind of into sort of semi-Tarrasch kind of territory, but this is a line where white does, I think, have a little bit of an advantage, where there are some plans like bishop a2, and then you can sort of like just kind of apply a lot of pressure, like just with the pieces in the center. Sometimes, the bishop also can slide back to provoke some weaknesses. Those are some typical plans from white's perspective, but with the move a6, Nihal kind of wants to avoid some main theory, but still play like in a very human sort of way. Probably from the theoretical point of view, a move like knight e5 could definitely be considered, as it does make b5 a lot less appealing when queen f5 comes with a tempo. That being said, black can play the move knight c6, which is sort of a good defensive idea to know in these IQPs. Where, yeah, you have an isolated pawn, but you're also making it virtually impossible for them to play d5. You kind of secure some squares for the pieces, and it sort of turns out that if you go deep enough with the analysis, black is basically okay here. So Gumelas plays the move bishop to f4 instead. Black goes b5. Also note, by the way, if white does play a4, that would be a little bit of a concession, because you do get the b4 outpost for the knight, which is quite nice, and you can also kind of easily build up the pressure against the d4 pawn. So here it is best just to let them play b5. But yeah, after bishop b3, bishop to b7, white plays a move rook c1. There is also a pawn sack at d5 that's suggested by the engines a bit, but I do think it does kind of liquidate just to being like a very dry position, so I don't really blame white for keeping a bit more tension. Black's next move here is a little bit of a difficult one. If you do want to pause video and try to figure it out, this is probably not a bad exercise. Because, I mean, it's not just about, solving puzzles like black's play and win, but, it's good to also solve position like just more like normal kind of middle games and end games in a sense. But yeah, well done if you came up with the move of bishop to b4, which is very much aimed against the move of d5 that I just mentioned. You want to play a move like knight c6 in principle, but d5 and letting the pieces kind of flood into the attack is obviously not really so nice from black's point of view. With every exchange, white is just getting better and better piece placement. Obviously, I mean queen d5 there, but yeah, you can kind of see how black can't even take the queen, because then they're going to lose the piece when we do all the counting at the end. So similar problem with knight d7 as well. Like if you go there, then d5, and you just run into really big problems. And a move like b4 is just a bit too big of a concession when you're kind of weakening these sort of outpost squares for white. So bishop b4 is just kind of the smallest evil of these options. White goes bishop g5, trying to sort of exploit the bishop left behind this diagonal. So it's a good like thinking technique in chess, what was left behind, like what squares or pieces were left behind by the opponent's last move. That being said, I expect the theoreticians are probably going to explore lines such as either a3 and then bishop knight to g5, setting up some sacks, or indeed the immediate knight g5, which is probably white's best chance to try to fight for something, but perhaps falls a little bit outside the scope of this video. But after bishop to g5, knight d7, I kind of feel like black is just doing fine here. Like if white plays knight e5, which is a very standard idea to try and sort of bring the piece in the attack, maybe lift the rook in some positions if we have stability over the center. Black's just going to play knight e5, and rook e5 doesn't really feel in the spirit of the position somehow when you can sort of kick him back. So I would probably go d5, but then the arising ending is basically just fine for black here. After rook e1, you do have to be a bit careful, of course, of some rook d7 and stuff, but it turns out the computer even points out this very nice little trick where you can even like sacrifice the pawn on f6, but kind of with the idea that you sort of get enough compensation with the bishop pair here. then basically you're going to be fine in this position. Like you sometimes can even try to get the pawn back and really sort of secure the equality. So white goes a3. There are a few ways you can play. Like you can play bishop a5, and maybe objectively that's the best, just to keep the pin and kind of keep the tension a bit. I don't know if he was afraid of some like bishop a2 or some rook lift later, but I think black should be able to deal with all of this. Like for example, you also have the idea of like b4 to kind of stop them playing b4 and ensure that you're always going to have like enough open lines on the queen side that are not really going to be able to mate your king here, in a sense. The black goes bishop c3, and one advantage of this approach is that it does create the imbalance of the bishop versus the knight. So even though objectively white may try to fight for something, I think that for playing for a win, this is quite a nice option. The move rook d3, it's interesting, but probably wouldn't change the assessment so much compared to the game's rook c to e3. Black plays queen to c7, just breaking the pin. We got knight e5 takes. White decides to go d takes e5. You could argue maybe that rook e5 might have been a better try, but probably just didn't like queen c6. You have to make some sort of concession like f3 or d5 kind of to really deal with this attack. So probably white just didn't want to get a position like this. He wanted to, try to make something of his initiative. But queen c6 is a very strong intermezzo here. Of course, rook g3 and knight e4 would be a little bit embarrassing for white. So instead, white plays rook f3. The knight still goes to e4 anyway. If you play a move like bishop f4, bishop e3, you are allowing the rook to attack the queen with tempo. And, already we can kind of feel that at this point that even though, objectively white probably isn't losing per se, that, the momentum has definitely shifted in black's favor. And also after bishop h4, h6 is actually just a really strong reply here, where basically black's threat is, let's say if white plays some pass move here, like, it's very little to find one, but let's just say they play a4, that doesn't really change the position too much. We're just going to play g5, and, just we don't have to think about the pawns, let's just flick in the exchange. And if white goes bishop g3, the problem is that black can just play rook f d8. And if, say, queen e2, just knight d2. And this is sort of black's idea that by breaking the pin, we're able, or breaking the control of the d8, we're able to kind of get in the win of material. So in order to avoid this, white kind of has to find bishop e7, and then in this way, white is certainly worse here, but at least it's not going to be like an immediate sort of win for black in a sense. White can still survive, probably. But instead he goes for the move rook f4, like trying to be a little bit tricky, trying to set up some attack here. But okay, what's the winner in this position for black? And ideally, you can mention, like in a comment, not just one move, like what's the follow-up after white's obvious reply, because anyone can guess a move because it looks nice, but like let's show that you actually have seen why it works. So the answer here is that the move is knight to c3. Note, by the way, knight f2 doesn't work because rook f2, and they do defend the mate with the rook there. But knight c3 does do the trick because, well, obviously we're threatening mate. That really limits white's options quite considerably. If they play queen g4, it's going to run into the same problem as in the game, actually, where, well, I'll just show you the move in case you haven't figured it out. In the game after queen f3, black played this winning blow of knight to e2 in this position. And white just resigned here, because obviously queen e2, queen g2 is checkmate. If you don't take, well, they're just going to take the rook and be up a rook. And of course, if rook e2, yeah, you just have the back rank mate. That's the crux of it. So, yeah, very nice little tactic by Nihal, and it kind of shows a good model, I think, of how to outplay somewhat low-rate players. Play something not too theoretical, get a bit of an imbalance to work with, and then you can kind of outplay the opponent from there. But yeah, that was my recap of the FIDE Grand Swiss. I really had a lot of fun following this tournament, and like I said, there are a lot of really great games in this tournament, even beyond the one I just showed you right here, the ones I showed you here. But these are really some of the highlights, and I think it goes to show that when you do play through these high-level games and really try to understand what's going on, it can't help but make you a much stronger player as such. Like, even if you only understand like 50% of what's happening in one of these games, that's still going to lead to quite a big improvement when you're doing that for lots and lots of games. But that's about all from me. Just a little bit of a different video, like I usually try to do a bit shorter ones, but it is nice to do a real deep dive and be able to really get into the weeds of some very interesting chess games and chess positions. But yeah, if there are sort of some players or some games you want me to go deeper into, you can also let me know that in the comments below. But for now, that's all from me, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.